In the spring of 2017, a name surfaced in a West Virginia police investigation that made seasoned detectives pause and look at each other across the interview room table. The name belonged to someone who had spent the last 2 decades walking freely through the same small town where, in 1996, a police officer was found dead in circumstances that never quite made sense. What came next wasn't just an arrest. It was the unraveling of 21 years of silence, misdirection, and a lie so carefully maintained that an entire community had built its assumptions around it. This is the story of how that lie finally fell apart. Before I reveal how a single conversation in 2017 exposed the truth about what happened on a cold November night in 1996, go ahead and subscribe. These stories are told to make sure the truth doesn't disappear with time. The town of Parsons, West Virginia, sits tucked into the Appalachian Mountains in Tucker County, a place where everyone knows everyone, where reputations are earned over lifetimes, and where trust is given slowly but held tightly. In 1996, Parsons had fewer than 2,000 residents. The kind of town where a police officer wasn't just law enforcement. He was a neighbor. A familiar face at the grocery store. Someone who coached Little League or helped jumpstart your car in the parking lot behind the diner. Officer Michael Braxton was 31 years old that November. He had been with the Parsons Police Department for 7 years, working patrol shifts that covered everything from domestic disputes to late-night calls about suspicious vehicles. Michael wasn't flashy. He didn't seek attention. His colleagues described him as steady, the kind of officer who showed up on time, did his job without complaint, and went home to his small rental house on the east side of town. He was single, kept to himself outside of work, and spent most of his free time fishing along the Cheat River or working on his truck in the driveway. People who knew Michael said he had a quiet intensity about him. He took his job seriously, maybe too seriously at times. When he pulled someone over for a broken taillight, he didn't just write the ticket and move on. He'd explain why it mattered, why a small thing like that could be the difference between getting home safe and ending up in a ditch on a dark mountain road. Some people found it endearing. Others found it annoying. But everyone agreed that Michael Braxton believed in doing things the right way. On the night of November 14, 1996, Michael was scheduled to work the evening shift, starting at 6 and running until 2 in the morning. It was a Thursday. The weather had turned cold earlier that week, and by evening, the temperature had dropped into the low 30s. A light frost had settled over the fields outside town, and the trees along the main road stood bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Michael clocked in at the station just before 6, exchanged a few words with the day shift officer heading home, and drove out in his patrol car to begin his rounds. His supervisor, Sergeant David Keller, remembered seeing him that evening. Michael had seemed normal. Maybe a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. He grabbed a cup of coffee from the station break room, made a joke about the Steelers game coming up that weekend, and headed out into the cold. What no one realized at the time was that Michael would never finish that shift. At approximately 11:47 p.m., dispatch received a call from a resident on Maple Ridge Road, a narrow stretch of pavement that wound through a wooded area on the outskirts of Parsons. The caller was a man named Eugene Foster, a retired postal worker who lived in a small house set back from the road. Foster reported seeing a police car parked at an odd angle off the side of the road, its headlights still on, engine running. The caller couldn't see anyone inside. He said he had driven past it once, continued home, then doubled back because something about it didn't sit right with him. Dispatch tried to raise Michael on the radio. No response. They tried again. Silence. The dispatcher on duty that night, a woman named Linda Hoffman, felt her stomach drop. In 7 years of working dispatch, she had never failed to reach an officer on patrol. There were dead zones in the mountains where radio signals got spotty, but Maple Ridge Road wasn't one of them. She tried Michael's cell phone. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. A second officer, Sergeant David Keller, was sent to investigate. When Keller arrived at the scene just after midnight, he found Michael's patrol car pulled onto the shoulder, driver's side door slightly ajar. The engine was still running. The radio was on. Michael's coat was draped across the passenger seat. But Michael wasn't there. Keller stepped out of his vehicle and called Michael's name into the darkness. The woods were silent except for the wind moving through the bare branches. He walked toward the tree line, shining his flashlight across the ground. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of dead leaves, exposed roots, and the frozen ground beneath. About 40 feet from the patrol car, just beyond the edge of the road, Keller found Michael Braxton lying face down in the dirt and leaves. Michael wasn't moving. Keller ran to him, dropped to his knees, and immediately called for backup and an ambulance. Michael's body was cold. There was no pulse. No breath. Keller turned him over gently and saw it. Blood. Dried blood across the side of Michael's head and matted into his hair. His service weapon was missing from his holster. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. Michael Braxton was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 31 years old. The investigation began immediately. Crime scene technicians arrived before dawn, working under portable floodlights to document the scene. What they found raised more questions than answers. Michael had been shot once in the head at close range. His service weapon, a Glock 22, was found approximately 15 feet from his body, partially concealed under a pile of leaves. There were no signs of a struggle. No defensive wounds. No indication that Michael had drawn his weapon or fought back. The positioning of the body troubled investigators. Michael was found lying on his stomach, but the angle of the wound suggested he had been facing his attacker when he was shot. That meant he had fallen forward, or been moved. His patrol car showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing inside had been disturbed. His wallet was still in his pocket. His watch was still on his wrist. If this was a robbery, nothing had been taken. Detectives combed through Michael's recent activity. His last radio contact with dispatch had been at 10:52 p.m., nearly an hour before the 911 call came in. He had reported a routine traffic stop on Route 72, nothing unusual. The driver had been given a warning for a broken headlight and sent on their way. After that, silence. Phone records showed no calls made or received from Michael's personal cell phone that night. His patrol car's onboard computer showed no additional activity logged after the traffic stop. Lead investigator Detective Raymond Cross spent the first 48 hours at the scene, refusing to leave until every inch of ground had been searched, every piece of potential evidence bagged and tagged. Cross was a 20-year veteran of the state police, a man known for his methodical approach and his refusal to accept easy answers. He had worked homicides before, but this was different. This was a cop. One of their own. Cross walked the scene over and over, trying to reconstruct what had happened. Michael's patrol car was positioned as if he had pulled over voluntarily, not in response to a pursuit or emergency. The door was ajar, which suggested he had gotten out willingly. The location of his body, 40 feet from the car, meant he had walked into the woods, or been led there. But why? What would make a trained police officer leave his vehicle and walk into a dark forest with someone? The only explanation that made sense was that Michael knew his attacker. That he had felt safe enough to step away from his car, to turn his back, to let his guard down. To the investigators working the case, this was a police officer killed in the line of duty. That made it personal. That made it urgent. But to the town of Parsons, it was something no one wanted to name. Fear. If a police officer could be killed on a quiet Thursday night on the outskirts of town, then no one was safe. The funeral was held on a gray November morning at the Methodist Church on Main Street. Officers from surrounding counties came in uniform to pay their respects. The church was standing room only. Michael's mother sat in the front row, silent and pale, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry during the service. She stared straight ahead, as if seeing something no one else could see. Her name was Margaret Braxton, and she was 62 years old. Michael had been her only child. His father had died when Michael was 12, and Margaret had raised him on her own, working 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. She had been so proud when Michael graduated from the police academy. She kept a framed photo of him in his uniform on the mantel in her living room, and she told everyone who would listen that her son was out there making a difference. Now he was gone, and she couldn't understand why. She couldn't understand how someone could take her boy and leave him in the dirt like he was nothing. After the funeral, people gathered at the church fellowship hall. They brought casseroles and pies, offered condolences in hushed voices, and tried to find words that didn't sound empty. Margaret stood near the back of the room, accepting embraces from people she had known her whole life, nodding when they said things like, "He's in a better place now," or "Time will heal." But she didn't believe any of it. Time wouldn't heal this. Nothing would. In the days following Michael's death, tips began pouring into the Parsons Police Department. People reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles on Maple Ridge Road that night. Others claimed they heard a gunshot around 11 o'clock, though no one could say for certain. One caller insisted they had seen a man running through the woods near the crime scene. When pressed for details, the caller couldn't provide a description. Just a man. Running. Detectives followed every lead, no matter how thin. They interviewed dozens of people. They checked alibis. They reviewed security footage from the few businesses in town that had cameras. They came up empty. Detectives focused their initial investigation on the possibility of a traffic stop gone wrong. Had Michael pulled someone over that night and failed to log it? Had he been ambushed during a routine encounter? They reviewed his recent arrests and citations, looking for anyone with a grudge. They interviewed drivers who had been stopped by Michael in the weeks leading up to his death. Nothing pointed to a clear suspect. One name kept surfacing in witness interviews, not as a suspect, but as background noise. Gerald Thomas Whitman. At the time, Whitman was 28 years old, a local mechanic who ran a small auto repair shop on the south end of Parsons. People knew him. He was polite, quiet, kept his business running without much fuss. He had grown up in Tucker County, graduated from the same high school most people in town had attended, and lived in a modest house less than 2 miles from where Michael's body was found. Whitman had no criminal record. No history of violence. No known connection to Michael Braxton beyond the fact that they lived in the same small town. When detectives interviewed him as part of their canvass of local residents, Whitman stated that he had been home alone the night of November 14, working late in his garage. He said he didn't hear anything unusual. Didn't see anything. He expressed shock and sadness about Michael's death, the way most people in Parsons did. The interview lasted less than 20 minutes. Whitman was thanked for his time and crossed off the list. What detectives didn't know then was that Gerald Whitman had lied. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to stall. Forensic analysis of the crime scene yielded little. The bullet recovered from Michael's skull was too damaged for ballistic comparison. There were no fingerprints on the service weapon aside from Michael's own. No DNA evidence. No witnesses who could definitively place anyone at the scene. The case file grew thicker, but the leads grew colder. Detective Cross refused to give up. He worked the case late into the night, poring over witness statements, looking for inconsistencies, for patterns, for anything that might crack the case open. His wife complained that he never came home anymore. His colleagues worried that the case was consuming him. But Cross couldn't let it go. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Michael Braxton lying in those woods, alone and cold. By the spring of 1997, the active investigation had slowed to a crawl. Detectives still worked the case, but they were chasing shadows. The FBI had been brought in to assist, given that the victim was a law enforcement officer, but even federal resources couldn't produce a breakthrough. The official theory remained that Michael had been ambushed during an unlogged traffic stop or a chance encounter with someone who had reason to fear police scrutiny. But without a suspect, without physical evidence linking anyone to the scene, the case began to drift into the realm of the unsolved. Cross retired in 1999, 3 years after Michael's death. He left the state police with the case still open, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. He would tell people, years later, that Michael Braxton was the one that got away. The one he couldn't solve. He died in 2011, never knowing that the answer had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. For the people of Parsons, life moved forward the way it always does after tragedy. Slowly. Carefully. Michael's name was added to a memorial plaque outside the police station. His mother moved away from Tucker County within a year, unable to bear the weight of staying in the place where her son had died. She relocated to a small apartment in Charleston, where no one knew her story, where she could grieve in private. She kept Michael's photo on the mantle there too, but she stopped talking about him. The pain was too much. The Methodist Church held a remembrance service on the first anniversary of his death. Fewer people attended than had come to the funeral. By the second anniversary, there was no service at all. People had moved on. Or they were trying to. Gerald Whitman continued to run his auto repair shop. Business was steady. He had a reputation for fair prices and honest work, the kind of reputation that takes years to build in a small town. He married in 1999, a woman named Donna who had moved to Parsons from Elkins to work as a dental hygienist. They met at the Baptist church, where Whitman had started attending services regularly. Donna thought he was kind, dependable, a little reserved but in a way that felt comforting rather than concerning. They dated for 6 months before he proposed. They bought a larger house on the north side of town in 2001. Whitman became a deacon at the Baptist church. He coached youth basketball at the community center. He sponsored a little league team. Parents trusted him with their children. Neighbors invited him to backyard barbecues. He was, by all appearances, a pillar of the community. And Michael Braxton's case remained unsolved. The years passed in a way that felt both fast and impossibly slow. By 2005, nearly a decade after Michael's death, the case file sat in a storage room at the Tucker County Sheriff's Office, boxed and labeled, gathering dust alongside other cold cases that had never been closed. Detectives who had worked the original investigation had retired or moved on to other departments. The institutional memory of the case was fading. New officers came in who had never heard of Michael Braxton, who didn't know that a cop had been killed on Maple Ridge Road, who drove past the spot where his body had been found without a second thought. But there was one person who never stopped thinking about November 14, 1996. His name was Lieutenant Frank Mercer, and in 2006, he was assigned to the West Virginia State Police Criminal Investigation Division. Mercer hadn't worked the original case. He had been a patrol officer in a different county when Michael was killed. But cold cases had become Mercer's specialty, and when he reviewed the file on Michael Braxton in the summer of 2007, something about it bothered him. It wasn't the lack of evidence. Mercer had seen plenty of cases go cold for that reason. It was the lack of motive. Michael Braxton wasn't involved in any high-profile investigations. He hadn't made enemies that anyone could identify. He was a patrol officer in a small town, doing routine work. So why had someone killed him? Mercer was 43 years old, a father of 2, a man who believed that every case had an answer if you looked hard enough. He had grown up in a small town himself, understood how communities worked, how secrets were kept, how people protected their own even when they shouldn't. He knew that solving a cold case wasn't about finding new evidence. It was about looking at old evidence with fresh eyes. He began re-interviewing people who had been questioned in 1996 and 1997. Most of them had little to add. Memories had faded. Details had blurred. But Mercer was methodical. He built a timeline of Michael's last day, hour by hour, using old phone records, dispatch logs, and witness statements. He mapped out every location Michael had been seen or reported. He looked for patterns. One name appeared more frequently than Mercer expected. Gerald Whitman. Not because Whitman was connected to Michael. But because Whitman's auto repair shop was located less than a mile from the last confirmed location of Michael's patrol car before he went silent that night. Mercer pulled the original interview report from 1996. Whitman had stated he was home alone, working in his garage. No alibi. No corroboration. But also no reason to suspect him. Mercer decided to speak with Whitman again, not as a suspect, but as someone who might remember something new after all these years. It was a routine follow-up. In the spring of 2008, Mercer drove to Parsons and knocked on the door of Whitman's home. Whitman invited him in. They sat in the living room, a comfortable space with family photos on the walls and a television playing quietly in the background. Mercer explained that he was taking a fresh look at Michael Braxton's case. Whitman nodded. He said he remembered the night well. Everyone in Parsons did. Mercer asked if Whitman had thought of anything over the years, any detail that might have seemed insignificant at the time but could be relevant now. Whitman shook his head. He hadn't. He repeated the same account he had given in 1996. Home alone. Working in the garage. Didn't hear or see anything unusual. Mercer thanked him and left. But something about the conversation stuck with him. Whitman had seemed calm. Maybe too calm. Most people, when re-interviewed about a murder case years later, showed at least some emotional response. Curiosity. Nervousness. Defensiveness. Whitman had shown none of that. He had been polite, cooperative, and completely detached. It wasn't evidence. It was just a feeling. But Mercer had learned to trust those feelings. Mercer knew that hesitation meant something, but he also knew he couldn't push too hard without risking Whitman shutting down or demanding a lawyer. The interview ended cordially. Whitman left the barracks and drove home. Mercer sat in his office and reviewed the recording, listening to that brief pause over and over. Over the next year, Mercer focused on building a more complete picture of Whitman's life in the months surrounding Michael's death. He tracked down old friends, former employees, anyone who might have insight into Whitman's state of mind in late 1996. Most people described Whitman as quiet, dependable, a little withdrawn but not in a way that raised concern. No one reported seeing him with a handgun, though several people mentioned he enjoyed hunting and was comfortable around firearms. One former employee, a man named Travis Gentry, mentioned something that caught Mercer's attention. Gentry had worked for Whitman in 1997 and remembered that Whitman kept a locked metal box in the back office of the shop. Gentry had asked about it once, curious what was inside. Whitman had brushed off the question, saying it was just old business records. Gentry hadn't pressed. But he remembered thinking it was odd that Whitman kept it locked when there were plenty of other valuables in the shop that weren't secured at all. Mercer made a note of it. A locked box wasn't evidence of anything. But it was another detail that didn't quite fit. Then, in early 2016, Mercer caught a break. A man named Dennis Callahan, who had lived next door to Whitman in 1996, reached out to the state police. Callahan had moved to North Carolina in 2000 and had been following the reopened investigation from a distance through news reports and social media. He said he had something he thought Mercer should know. Callahan explained that in November 1996, just days after Michael Braxton's death, he had been outside late one evening and noticed Whitman in his backyard, digging near the edge of the property line. It was close to midnight. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and Callahan remembered thinking it was strange that anyone would be out there in the cold, working with a shovel. He had watched from his kitchen window for a few minutes, then gone to bed. Callahan thought it was odd, but he didn't say anything at the time. People grieve in strange ways, he figured. Maybe Whitman was planting something in memory of the officer, or just keeping himself busy to cope with the stress. Callahan had never mentioned it to police because it didn't seem relevant. But now, nearly 20 years later, Callahan wondered if it had been relevant after all. Mercer obtained a search warrant for Whitman's former property. The house had changed hands twice since Whitman sold it in 2004, but the backyard remained largely undisturbed. In March 2016, forensic teams excavated the area Callahan had described. They dug carefully, sifting through layers of soil and clay. 3 feet down, they found a rusted metal box. Inside the box was a Glock 22 handgun, corroded but intact. The serial number was still visible. The weapon was registered to Michael Braxton. The discovery shifted everything. Mercer now had physical evidence linking Gerald Whitman directly to the crime. But it still wasn't enough for an arrest. Whitman's defense could argue that he found the weapon, that someone else had buried it on his property, that the gun's presence didn't prove he had pulled the trigger. Mercer needed more. He returned to the 2014 interview recording, analyzing every word, every pause, every shift in tone. He brought in a forensic linguist to review Whitman's statements, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. The linguist noted that Whitman's account of his activities on November 14, 1996, was unusually detailed for an event that had occurred 18 years earlier. Most people couldn't recall what they had for dinner last week, let alone what they were doing on a specific Thursday night 2 decades ago. Whitman's memory was suspiciously clear. That suggested rehearsal. A story told and retold so many times it had become locked in place. In the summer of 2016, Mercer decided to apply pressure. He contacted Whitman and asked him to come in for another interview. This time, Whitman hesitated. He asked if he needed a lawyer. Mercer told him it was his choice, but that cooperation would go a long way in clearing up lingering questions. Whitman agreed to come in, but this time, he brought an attorney. The interview was tense. Mercer informed Whitman that Michael Braxton's service weapon had been recovered from his former property. Whitman's expression didn't change. His attorney immediately stated that the presence of the weapon on property Whitman no longer owned proved nothing. Mercer agreed. But he asked Whitman if he could explain how the weapon might have ended up there. Whitman said he couldn't. He had no idea. Mercer then presented evidence that Whitman had purchased a Glock 22 in 1994, 2 years before Michael's death, from a private seller in Elkins. The transaction had been legal, but Whitman had never registered the weapon with local authorities, as was customary at the time. Mercer asked why Whitman had lied during the 2014 interview when he said he had never owned a handgun. Whitman's attorney interjected. The interview was over. Over the winter of 2016 and into early 2017, Mercer worked with prosecutors to build a case. The discovery of Michael's service weapon on Whitman's former property, combined with Whitman's inconsistent statements and the established grudge over the 1995 citation, formed the foundation of probable cause. But the case remained circumstantial. No one had seen Whitman with Michael that night. No forensic evidence placed him at the crime scene on Maple Ridge Road. What prosecutors needed was a confession. Or a witness. Something human that could connect the dots between suspicion and certainty. Mercer spent long hours in his office, staring at the case file, looking for the missing piece. He reviewed every interview, every tip, every scrap of information that had come in over the years. He thought about Michael Braxton, about the life that had been cut short, about the mother who had died without answers. He thought about Gerald Whitman, about how a man could carry the weight of a murder for 2 decades without breaking. Then, in February 2017, Mercer received a phone call that changed everything. The caller identified herself as Rachel Whitman. She said she was Gerald Whitman's ex-wife. They had divorced in 2010 after 11 years of marriage. Rachel said she had been following the investigation and needed to speak with someone. She said she had been carrying something for a long time, and she couldn't carry it anymore. Mercer met with Rachel in a private office at the state police barracks. She was 41 years old, thin and nervous, her hands trembling as she spoke. She said that in 2009, during the final months of their marriage, Gerald had come home late one night after drinking heavily. They had been arguing about money, about the failing state of their relationship, about the weight of secrets neither of them had been willing to name. That night, Gerald had told her something she had never repeated to anyone. He said he had killed Michael Braxton. Rachel said she hadn't believed him at first. She thought he was drunk, saying things to hurt her, to scare her, to make her feel complicit in something terrible. But the way he said it, the flat, empty tone of his voice, had stayed with her. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain why or how. He just said it, then walked outside and sat in his truck for hours. Rachel said she had been terrified. She didn't know if it was true, but she couldn't bring herself to report it. She was afraid of what Gerald might do if she betrayed him. Afraid of what it would mean for her own safety. So she stayed quiet. They divorced the following year, and she moved to Morgantown. She had tried to forget what Gerald had told her, tried to convince herself it had been the alcohol talking, nothing more. But when she saw the news reports about the weapon being found, about Gerald being questioned again, she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Mercer asked Rachel if she would be willing to testify. She said yes. She said she owed it to Michael Braxton. She owed it to herself. The weight Rachel had carried for 8 years was visible in the way she sat, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. She told Mercer that there had been nights when she couldn't sleep, when she would lie awake and wonder if she was complicit by staying silent. She said she had gone to therapy, tried to work through the guilt, but nothing helped. The therapist didn't know the real reason she was there. Rachel couldn't bring herself to say the words out loud. Mercer listened. He didn't rush her. He understood that what Rachel was doing took more courage than most people could imagine. She was breaking the final bond of loyalty to a man who had made her an unwilling keeper of his darkest secret. Before she left that day, Rachel asked Mercer a question. She wanted to know if Michael Braxton's mother was still alive. Mercer told her the truth. Margaret Braxton had passed away in 2012. Rachel's face crumpled. She said she wished she had come forward sooner, that maybe Michael's mother could have had some peace before she died. Mercer told her that what she was doing now still mattered. That it was never too late to do the right thing. On March 28, 2017, Gerald Thomas Whitman was arrested at his home in Parsons and charged with the murder of Officer Michael Braxton. He was 50 years old. He did not resist. He did not speak. He was taken into custody and held without bail. The arrest sent shockwaves through Tucker County. People who had known Whitman for decades struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the crime he was accused of committing. Some refused to believe it. Others looked back and wondered if they had missed the signs, if they had been too willing to accept his calm demeanor as proof of innocence rather than the mask it had been. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. The headline read, "Local Mechanic Arrested in 1996 Police Officer Slaying." The article included a photo of Whitman being led into the courthouse in handcuffs, his head down, his expression unreadable. The comments section filled with reactions. Some people expressed shock. Others said they had always known something was off about him. A few defended him, insisting that the police had arrested the wrong man. The case did not go to trial immediately. Whitman's attorney filed motions to suppress evidence, to exclude Rachel's testimony as hearsay, to challenge the validity of the search warrant that had led to the discovery of the buried weapon. The legal process dragged on for months. The prosecution argued that Rachel's testimony was admissible as a statement against interest, made voluntarily during the course of their marriage. The defense countered that the statement was unreliable, influenced by the emotional turmoil of a failing relationship and clouded by alcohol. Judge Patricia Hensley presided over the pretrial hearings, a stern woman in her late 50s who had a reputation for running a tight courtroom. The hearings stretched through the spring and summer of 2017. Mercer attended every session, sitting in the back row, watching as lawyers argued over the admissibility of evidence he had spent years gathering. It was excruciating. Every motion, every delay felt like another obstacle between Michael Braxton and justice. The people of Parsons watched too. The courthouse became a gathering place for those who wanted to see how the case would unfold. Local television crews set up outside, interviewing residents about their reactions. A retired teacher named Helen Morris told a reporter that she had known Gerald Whitman since he was a boy, that she couldn't believe he was capable of murder. A former co-worker from the auto shop said he wasn't surprised at all, that there had always been something cold about Whitman, something that didn't quite connect. Everyone had an opinion. Few had facts. In October 2017, Judge Hensley ruled that Rachel's testimony would be allowed. The statement Gerald had made to her, she determined, bore sufficient indicia of reliability given the context in which it was made and the corroborating physical evidence. The defense had lost a critical battle. Whitman's attorney, a sharp-minded public defender named Martin Kessler, knew that going to trial with Rachel's testimony on the record would be risky. A jury hearing a man's ex-wife testify that he confessed to murder would be difficult to overcome, especially with Michael's service weapon found buried on his former property. Kessler approached the prosecution with a proposal. Then, in November 2017, nearly 21 years to the day after Michael Braxton's death, Gerald Whitman's attorney approached prosecutors with a proposal. Whitman was willing to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a reduced sentence. He would admit to killing Michael Braxton. He would allocate to the facts. But he would not go into detail about motive or premeditation. The prosecution considered the offer carefully. A trial was never a certainty. Juries were unpredictable. And while the evidence against Whitman was strong, it was still largely circumstantial. Rachel's testimony was powerful, but the defense could attack her credibility. They could argue she had fabricated the confession out of spite, that she was trying to hurt her ex-husband after a bitter divorce. The buried weapon was damning, but without forensic evidence tying Whitman to the trigger, a skilled defense attorney could create reasonable doubt. Prosecutors accepted the deal. On November 9, 2017, in a courtroom in Elkins, Gerald Whitman stood before Judge Hensley and admitted that on the night of November 14, 1996, he had shot and killed Officer Michael Braxton. The courtroom was packed. Mercer sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Former colleagues of Michael's filled the seats behind him. Residents of Parsons who had followed the case for 2 decades came to witness the moment they thought might never arrive. Whitman stood at the defense table, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. His face was expressionless. The prosecutor read the terms of the plea agreement aloud. Whitman would admit to second-degree murder. He would provide a brief allocation explaining what happened that night. In exchange, the prosecution would recommend a sentence of 30 years, with eligibility for parole after 22. Judge Hensley looked at Whitman and asked if he understood the terms. He said he did. She asked if anyone had coerced him into accepting the plea. He said no. She asked if he was pleading guilty because he was, in fact, guilty. Whitman paused. For just a moment, his composure faltered. Then he said yes. The prosecutor asked Whitman to explain what happened on November 14, 1996. Whitman spoke slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. He said he had been driving on Maple Ridge Road that night when he saw Michael's patrol car parked on the side of the road. He said Michael had pulled him over earlier that week for a broken taillight and had been, in Whitman's words, disrespectful. He said he had been angry about the citation he received in 1995, angry about the way Michael had treated him, angry about feeling like he was being targeted. He said he pulled over and approached Michael's car. They had exchanged words. The argument escalated. Whitman said he went back to his truck, retrieved a handgun he kept under the seat, and returned to where Michael was standing near the tree line. He said Michael turned to face him, and Whitman fired once. He said he panicked. He took Michael's service weapon to make it look like the officer had been ambushed. He left the scene, drove home, and buried both weapons in his backyard. He said he closed his shop for 2 days because he couldn't function. He said he had been living with the guilt ever since. He did not explain why the argument had escalated to murder. He did not express remorse for taking a life. He did not apologize to Michael's family or colleagues. He simply stated the facts, as if reading from a script, and then fell silent. Judge Hensley asked if the prosecution had any objections to the allocation. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Diane Merrick, stood and said the allocation was consistent with the evidence. She recommended the agreed-upon sentence. The judge turned to Whitman. She told him that his actions had destroyed a family, traumatized a community, and betrayed the trust of everyone who had known him. She said that 21 years was a long time to carry a secret, but it was also a long time for the people who loved Michael Braxton to live without answers. She said that justice delayed was not justice denied, but it was a justice that came at a terrible cost. She sentenced Gerald Whitman to 30 years in the state penitentiary. He would be eligible for parole after serving 22 years. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at anyone. In the weeks following Whitman's plea, the people of Parsons tried to make sense of what had happened. How had a man lived among them for 2 decades, carrying the weight of a murder, without anyone suspecting? How had he attended church, coached children, fixed their cars, shared meals with neighbors, all while knowing what he had done? The questions lingered in coffee shops and church basements, in conversations at the grocery store and late-night discussions around kitchen tables. Some people said they should have known. Others said there was no way they could have. The truth, as it so often is, lay somewhere in between. Whitman had hidden in plain sight not because he was a criminal mastermind, but because people wanted to believe the best about their neighbors. Because suspicion requires evidence, and evidence requires someone willing to look. There were people in Parsons who felt betrayed on a personal level. Parents whose children Whitman had coached felt sick thinking about the man who had encouraged their kids, taught them teamwork and sportsmanship, all while hiding the fact that he had taken a life. Members of the Baptist Church struggled with the cognitive dissonance of a deacon who had stood before the congregation and preached about integrity while living a lie. Others felt a different kind of pain. They wondered if they had enabled Whitman by being too trusting, too willing to accept his version of normalcy. They wondered if there had been signs they missed, small moments when the mask slipped and they simply looked away. One woman, a longtime member of the Baptist Church named Carolyn Hughes, told a local reporter that she remembered a moment during a church potluck in 2003 when someone had mentioned Michael Braxton's unsolved murder. Whitman had been standing nearby, holding a plate of food, and Carolyn had noticed his expression go blank. Not sad. Not curious. Just blank. She said she had thought it was strange at the time, but she hadn't dwelled on it. Now she couldn't stop thinking about it. Lieutenant Frank Mercer retired from the state police in 2018. Before he left, he returned to Parsons and visited the memorial plaque outside the police station where Michael Braxton's name was engraved. He stood there for a long time, not saying anything, just looking at the letters carved into metal. A journalist who had been covering the case approached him and asked how it felt to finally solve the case after so many years. Mercer didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at the plaque. Then he said that solving a case didn't feel the way people thought it would. There was no rush of triumph. No sense of victory. Just a quiet acknowledgement that a question had been answered, that a lie had been exposed, that the truth had finally come to light. He said the hardest part was knowing that Michael's mother never got to see this day. Margaret Braxton had died in 2012, 5 years before Whitman's arrest. She never got to hear the words, "guilty," spoken in a courtroom. She never got to know that the person who killed her son had been held accountable. That loss, that absence of closure, was something Mercer carried with him long after the case was closed. Rachel Whitman moved out of state after the trial. She changed her name. She tried to build a life that wasn't defined by the secret she had kept for so many years. In interviews, she said she wished she had come forward sooner. She said she would carry the guilt of her silence for the rest of her life. But she also said that fear is a powerful thing, and sometimes it takes years to find the courage to break free of it. She said that Gerald had been a different person when they first met. Quiet, yes. Reserved, certainly. But not someone who seemed capable of violence. It wasn't until later in their marriage that she began to see the cracks. The way he never talked about his past. The way he deflected questions about his time before they met. The way he reacted when Michael Braxton's name came up in conversation, always changing the subject, always steering away. She said the night he confessed to her was the night she realized she had been living with a stranger. That the man she thought she knew had never really existed. The case of Michael Braxton's murder became a textbook example in West Virginia law enforcement circles of how cold cases can be solved through persistence, re-examination of old facts, and the willingness of witnesses to come forward even after decades of silence. It also became a cautionary tale about how assumptions made in the immediate aftermath of a crime can shape an investigation in ways that obscure the truth rather than reveal it. In 1996, investigators had assumed that Michael's killer was someone with a serious grudge, someone with a violent history, someone who would have stood out in a small community. They had looked for patterns that matched their expectations. What they hadn't considered was that the killer might be someone ordinary, someone who had managed to compartmentalize his actions and continue living a normal life. That assumption had cost the case 21 years. Training seminars for cold case investigators now include Michael's case as an example of why every lead, no matter how mundane, needs to be followed. Why a lack of criminal history doesn't mean a lack of capability. Why the people who seem the least suspicious are sometimes the ones who should be examined most closely. If you think Michael Braxton deserved someone to keep pushing for the truth, hit that subscribe button. Trolls won't. But you're here because you understand that justice delayed is still justice, even when it arrives 21 years late. Michael Braxton never got to grow old. He never got to retire from the force, never got to fish the Cheat River on a quiet Sunday morning without the weight of a badge on his belt. He was 31 years old when Gerald Whitman decided that an argument on a dark road was worth taking a life. And for 21 years, that decision went unanswered. But it didn't go forgotten. There's something to be said about the people who refuse to let go, who keep pulling at threads even when the fabric seems too worn to unravel. Lieutenant Mercer was one of those people. So was Rachel Whitman, in the end. So were the witnesses who called in tips years after the fact, not knowing if their information would matter, but willing to try. In small towns, the past doesn't disappear. It lingers in the spaces between words, in the glances people exchange when a name is mentioned, in the stories that are told and retold until they become something close to myth. Michael Braxton's story could have become one of those myths, a tragic unsolved mystery that people whispered about but never understood. Instead, it became a resolution. A name. A guilty plea. A man led away in handcuffs. That doesn't erase the 21 years. It doesn't bring Michael back. It doesn't give his mother the closure she deserved before she died. But it does something. It removes the question mark. It replaces silence with an answer, even if the answer is incomplete, even if it leaves scars. Justice in cold cases is never clean. It's never as satisfying as we want it to be. It arrives too late, costs too much, and leaves too many people wounded. But it still matters. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is a lie that lasts forever. Gerald Whitman spent 21 years as a free man, building a life on top of a secret that should have destroyed him. He coached kids. He went to church. He fixed engines and smiled at customers and lived as if November 14, 1996, had never happened. And maybe, for a while, he even believed his own performance. But lies have a way of collapsing under their own weight. Not always quickly. Not always obviously. But eventually, the foundation cracks. And when it does, everything built on top of it comes down. The people of Parsons are still processing what it means to have lived alongside a killer for 2 decades without knowing. Some of them feel betrayed. Others feel foolish. A few feel vindicated, as if they had always sensed something was off but couldn't name it. Most just feel tired. Tired of the weight of it. Tired of the questions that still don't have answers. Why did Whitman kill Michael Braxton? Was it really just an argument that escalated, or was there something deeper, something premeditated, something he chose not to admit even in his guilty plea? We'll probably never know. Whitman took that truth with him when he was let out of the courtroom, and he hasn't spoken about it since. Maybe that's the hardest part. Not the crime itself, but the refusal to fully account for it. The unwillingness to give the people left behind the one thing they deserve most, the whole truth. Michael Braxton was remembered by his colleagues as a man who did his job without fanfare, who showed up and did the work even when it was hard, even when it was thankless. That's the kind of person small towns rely on. The kind of person who holds things together not because they seek glory, but because they believe in duty. And on a cold November night in 1996, that sense of duty led him to Maple Ridge Road, where he encountered a man who saw him not as a person, but as an obstacle. A problem to be solved with a single gunshot. Sergeant David Keller, the officer who found Michael's body that night, retired from the Parsons Police Department in 2015. In his final interview with the local newspaper, he was asked what he remembered most about that night. He said he remembered the silence. How quiet the woods were. How the only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the radio in Michael's patrol car still crackling with static. He said he remembered thinking that Michael shouldn't have been alone out there. That if he had been with a partner, if someone had been there to watch his back, maybe things would have been different. But Parsons was a small department. They didn't have the resources for 2-officer patrols. So Michael had been out there by himself, doing his job, trusting that the people in his community weren't a threat. That trust had cost him his life. Keller said he carried that night with him every day after. He said there wasn't a shift he worked where he didn't think about Michael, didn't wonder if he could have done something different, arrived sooner, noticed something that would have changed the outcome. He knew, logically, that he couldn't have prevented what happened. But logic doesn't ease guilt. The memorial plaque outside the Parsons Police Department was updated after Whitman's conviction. Beneath Michael's name and the date of his death, a new line was added: "Case closed, November 9, 2017. It was a small acknowledgement, but it mattered. It meant that Michael's death was no longer an open question. It meant that someone had been held accountable. Every year on November 14, a few people still gather at that plaque. Retired officers. Friends. People who never knew Michael but feel connected to his story. They don't hold a formal service. They just stand there for a while, paying their respects, remembering a man who died doing his job. 21 years later, that problem finally came back to Gerald Whitman. And this time, he couldn't bury it. Rest in peace, Michael Braxton. You were not forgotten. The kind of person who stays with stories like this until the very end is exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. You don't look away from uncomfortable truths. You don't need justice to be quick or perfect to recognize that it still matters. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. But before you go, there's one more thing worth considering. In 1996, Gerald Whitman made a choice. He chose to take a life, to hide that act, and to live as if it never happened. For 21 years, that choice seemed to work. He built a life. He earned trust. He became someone people relied on. But somewhere, deep down, he must have known. He must have woken up some mornings and remembered what he'd done. He must have driven past that memorial plaque, seen Michael's name, and felt something, guilt, fear, the weight of knowing that the truth was always there, waiting. And in the end, the truth found him anyway. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't care about time. It doesn't care about performance or reputation or the life you've built on top of lies. It just is. And eventually, one way or another, it comes to light. The question is, how many other Gerald Whitmans are out there right now, living in small towns, carrying secrets that have been buried for decades? How many cold cases remain unsolved not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because no one has looked closely enough at the person who seemed too ordinary to be guilty? I'll see you in the next one.